Hi, and welcome to this online event by the American Book Center, the ABC as we like to call it. And it's the best source of English language books based in the Netherlands. I work there, and my name is Luke Nyman, and it's great to have you with us. I'm very happy to be introducing this interview about Russell Shorto's new book, Smalltime. This is the book. You can order it online at abc.nl, and you'll find the link below this video, at least if you're on YouTube. Or right now, you can make an appointment to come to the shop, either by calling us or, again, looking on our website. You can reserve it there. Now, I believe we're in for quite a treat with an American writer who's lived and written about Amsterdam and New York, being interviewed by a Dutch writer, a born and bred Amsterdammer, who now lives in New York. Russell Shorto is, as I think we all know, a best-selling author by books like Island at the Center of the World, or Island at the American Book Center of the World, as we like to say. And also my fun thing is Amsterdam. I've sold many copies of this in my section about Holland and Amsterdam. So it's very nice to finally meet the man as well. So, and now here he shares his thoughts on his latest book, Smalltime, delving into his own family history, and at the same time giving an insight into the growth of the phenomenon that came to be known as the mafia in the last century. Now, with a man of such stature, we needed to find a worthy interviewer, and we were delighted when our request was accepted by none other than Arnon Grunberg. Also a man of many words, he's written in just about all forms possible and collected just as many prizes for novels like Tierza, which made into a movie, essays, plays, and also columns for major newspapers and magazines around the world. So with that, it's time for me to wrap up and get the hell out of Dodge and let you enjoy Russell Shorto talking about Smalltime in an interview with Arnon Grunberg.
You were telling me about this book, and you made me very curious. And I must admit that our brief conversation before the show was the best part for me of that evening. And I'm very glad that ABC gave me another incentive to read this book, so I can interview you tonight. I must say it was a delightful experience. It's very personal. It's about your family. It's about migration, what it means to move from one country to another, to be an outsider. It's about the history of the US, and it's also about the art of the con man. When I was finished reading, when I was done with the book, I had the feeling not only that you had made the con man very attractive, but also I asked myself the question, how is it possible to be alive and to not be a con man? There are many sentences and sometimes even paragraphs that are underlined. I'd like to walk through the book by some of my favorite sentences. Probably there are too many because we have about 40 minutes, and then I'll open the questions for the audience. They have about 15 or 20 minutes. But I'd like to start at the beginning. Then there in the beginning, you write this paragraph. I feel a need to declare here that I had a normal, small-town America childhood, meaning that it was weird or quaint in all the standard ways. Going on Sunday drives as a family, playing strip poker with hushed friends in somebody's parents' basement, whatever. There was an element of Italian-American self-awareness, but it was mostly limited to food and emotiveness. Long conversations about spaghetti sauce and aunts who kissed you on the lips. Those were the ways we were Italian. That made me smile, made me laugh, because I had two questions immediately after reading this. First, is there another way of being Italian in America? The only way.
Maybe you're right. Maybe those are the only ways of being Italian, because you're not, for the most part, speaking Italian. So being Italian in America these days certainly means, I mean, it's more than an affectation, but it's just, and it's kind of a sensibility, and everybody, over time blends in with everybody else. So, and that certainly happened with, and in a way, the book is about me looking at my quite blended Italian Americanness and then comparing that with my father's generation and then with my grandparents' generation, and looking at how more concentrated it becomes the further you go back.
Well, but also basically it's a description how this identity is fading away. Would you say that there is still now in 2021 a thing called American Italian identity? Does it still exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in many respects, when I was working on the book, when I was writing it, I felt that I was writing, I mean, an Italian-American story, but really I just felt I was writing an immigrant story. The mafia is a particular overlay that happened in the Italian community, but it's not so different from the Irish American immigration, Polish American immigration. You had Jewish gangs in cities, and so it's so what you're asking about is, I think, not just Italian American, but about that hyphenated identity. People cling to those things, and we're seeing, I think, in the past, what we were talking about in November, we were talking about American politics in the presidential election, was this great tangle of all these different identities, some of which go way back to earlier generations, and some of which are regional, some of which are based on economic class. So that's what the country is, and I guess you could say the same thing about the Netherlands too, but with a different focal point. That's what we're all kind of debating and trying to sort out in our own heads. What does it mean to be an American or an Italian American?
Do you have an answer?
Well, I guess that's what we're trying to work out, right? right tonight, and that's what I was, in a way, trying to work out in writing this book. My simplistic notion when I looked into it was about, okay, I'll look into my grandfather, and really I'll be telling the story of the small town mob, which is a thing that people don't really know. They know, when they think of the mob, they think of New York and Chicago, that kind of thing. And it was that for me, and I think that's there in the book, but it's really just this, and so many, this is the first time I've written a book that's within living memory, and I interviewed hundreds of people, not hundreds of people, hundreds of hours of interviews with people who were still alive. And in the, whatever it's been, a month and a half since the book was published in the US, I have gotten hundreds of emails and contacts on Facebook and whatever, and one actual letter. And a lot of it is about this stuff. It's about, well, I grew up in a Polish community or a Hungarian community or a small, we were Italian Americans in Rockford, Illinois, or some other kind of medium or small sized town. So there's all these overlapping experiences. And that's something, this as well as I do, or better than I do, that you write a book and you think you know what it's about and who will be interested, but only when it's out there and you start interacting with people do you begin to get a sense of who it's resonating with and why. So in one sense, it's these small town communities, many of which, like Johnstown, have become Rust Belt towns. They're really economically depressed. And there's some semblance of this kind of ethnic, this hyphenated identity that's part of it. A lot of people are writing me and just launching right in and saying things, because I was so personal about my family. They're launching in with things like, well, my father committed suicide when I was a kid. And, they're just immediately, as if I'm Miss Lonely Hearts or something, they're telling me all of these personal, I guess they felt I was personal with them. So now they're going to open up with me, and it's a very different experience from, writing a history that took place 300 years ago.
Because it's alive, as you mentioned, and it's also about your own family. So you said already, it's also in the book, it's evident that you interviewed so many people for so many hours. Did you have the feeling, did you feel the need to protect people?
Protecting people I'm interviewing?
Yeah, to leave out certain details, to decide this might be a bit too painful for some of my family members.
Oh,
going
Yeah, well, you can tell me if you agree with this, but I think that when you're going to write something, you just go ahead and write it. I mean, you don't. It's not a good idea to put the brakes on at the start. You just let it out, and then later, once it's there, you can look at it and maybe. And a lot of the people, a lot of my family members, read the book in draft, and I told them I was going to show it to them, and if somebody weighed in and had some issue with a certain thing, then I thought about it, and we talked about it. So there were a few things like that I left out because I thought it's not really germane to the book and it's causing this person particular pain. So I won't do that.
That's clear. I'd like to go to the second quote, and it's about the man Joe Regino, also the beginning. One of those men, you might have been right there at the counter, where he liked to perch on a stool. His name was Joe Regino, but everyone called him Little Joe. You said it with respect. Little Joe ran the town. He was born 53 years earlier in southern Italy, emigrated with his parents, and grew up on the mean streets of Philadelphia. He got involved in the mafia before most Americans had heard the word. His first arrest in 1928 was for armed robbery. One of the things I appreciated so much about your book, that on the one hand, I mean, just by reading the name Joe Regino, at least I immediately thought of movies by Scorsese or by Francis Ford Coppola. I also gave you a blurb. So we have this image of the mafia because of all the movies that basically produced the myth of the mafia, of the mob, and in a way, the way you describe it, it's so the glamour is not there. The glamour we used to know from the movies. So it's the opposite. On the one hand, you think of Scorsese movies. On the other hand, there in your book, it's just despair, basically. Well, a lot of despair.
You're shot through with these little moments of celebration
of the weddings. So yeah. I was wondering, by writing this book, do you have the feeling? I mean, of course, the movies came later, but still, these people you spoke to were now in their 80s. Some of them have passed away. That there is this influence that those directors influence the way they are seeing their own tradition, their own background, their own history.
I think that I think you're right that it seems like to a large extent that myth was created by, in particular, the movies. There seems to be, there's something it's based on, and there's something mysterious in the whole in the mafia in Sicily. So this carries back. One of the things as I said before, one of the things I really wanted to do was use this book as a way to focus on the small town mob and how pervasive it was. I mean, every town in America. One of the things I did in my research was I got FBI Freedom of Information Act requests. It took about 4 years for me to start getting the material, and then these CDs started, and then I had to find a CD player because who has CD players anymore to unpack these documents. But it was everywhere. It was in Scranton and Schenectady and Amarillo, Texas, and Fresno, California, and Butte, Montana, and Anchorage, Alaska. It was all over, and it was a very definite network. And it occurred to me at one point that it kind of stitched together the country the way the interstate highway system did, and it was built around the same time. But people don't think so, and that's what I get in a lot of the emails I've gotten too. Is people saying things like, yeah, the way you describe it, that's how we did things in our town somewhere else. Or saying, I heard all these kind of whispers and stories about my grandfather or whatever in the past, and this kind of provides a template for me to understand that. And for that matter, people in my town have been writing me as well and saying similar things. And I think because that kind of story, which is less glamorous, is so pervasive. But the other thing about it is so woven into the mid 20th century American experience. I mean, it's just a part of life. It was a part of this. So my grandfather and his brother-in-law, Little Joe, ran the town. They ran the mafia in town. They had a cigar store in front, and behind that, a pool hall. It was called City Cigar. It was 2 doors from City Hall. And the mayor would walk in and at lunchtime every day and hang out with them, and presumably would leave with an envelope of cash. They would pay off the police. Everybody, it was the sort of higher class pool hangout. They also controlled another pool hall further downtown which was where it was a more working class hangout. Everybody I interviewed over a certain age, over the age of 75 or something, they knew them. They didn't have, the people I'm interviewing weren't necessarily associated with them. They didn't work for them necessarily, but they knew them. They played the numbers. They knew that they provided public services. And I was surprised the extent to which they looked up to them. They did a good job of selling themselves as being on the side of the little guy. There was a really strong class tension in America then. And in a place like Johnstown, that was very, it was graphically on display. The Johnstown flood is this famous historical event where the big shots, the owners of the steel companies from Pittsburgh, decided they would build a lake on the top of a mountain and build their summer homes there, and then they and their families would enjoy that experience. And then the lake, the dam broke, and the water came flooding down. Johnstown was at the bottom of it, the hill, and 2,000 people died, most of them within 10 minutes. So that was this really graphic, and this was in 1889, so it's going back further still, graphic display of that kind of class tension, the town literally getting dumped on by these people. And so when they created this kind of setup, they were providing cheap thrills for ordinary people, and at the same time doing it in such a way that they were making people, even though they themselves were making a lot of money, they were making them feel like they were one of them. And funnily enough, they were, because they were, they themselves had been discriminated against. I mean, that kind of prejudice against Southern Italians at the time was really strong.
That's in your book. Yeah, I'd like to talk about it later. But also, you were saying that they created the image of being on the side of just the average man, of the working class. And later in the book, there's this beautiful quote. I think it's by Mike, who then says, one of those people involved in the mob, he says, I never fucked little men, only the rich man, the upper class. So do you think that there is a kernel of truth to this, or do you think it's just an image they created in order to run their businesses better?
Well, I think they came from that. My grandfather and Little Joe, they in both cases, their parents had come from Sicily out of very desperate circumstances. And once they arrived, in order to work at coal mines, to do work that nobody else wanted to do, they were incredibly restricted. They had to live in company towns. They were told where they could spend their money, which was basically at the company store. So that's how they grew up, in this very economically depressed. I mean, it was a better life comparatively than what they had left. They weren't starving, but they were very discriminated against, and they grew up with that sense of, this is the group I belong to. And so they would do things. You see that once they became, their heyday was from World War II until the early 60s. And they were really pulling in a lot of money. And just the way they would spend it, people told me that my grandfather would come into a diner or lunch counter for lunch, and he'd leave, and then later everybody would find out he had bought lunch for everybody in the place, So that was their way. I mean, it's kind of smart politics,
Something back. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you're buying votes, kind of, you're buying people's support. I don't know if they quite saw it that way, or if they thought it was just this is how you do that. This is what you do with your money.
And they were not, at that time at least, they were not considered like organized crime at all. They were just part of what you were saying, part of the town, part of daily life. Just a question. I mean, you were talking about the discrimination that the Italians in America suffered. There was this quote, this paragraph that kind of shocked me. Page 44. You write, the 11 men who were hanged in the largest mass lynching in American history in New Orleans in 1891 were not black but Italian. The New York Times defended the extra-legal executions, calling the victims sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins.
Yeah, I think that's that is the atmosphere that they grew up in, these guys. And it's remarkable the extent to which, and this carries through to today, the extent to which you have American immigration, and then you have American prejudice and anger towards immigrants. And then you have reactions to that, and that's kind of how the mob comes into being. So America says, we have all these jobs we want to get people to do. So they put out the word in Southern Europe, and in a pretty short span of time, 4 million Southern Italians come to the U.S. and they work either in coal mines or plantations, and then there's this backlash against that. And so around in the 1920s, when my grandfather was coming of age, that's when the Ku Klux Klan comes back. It had come into being after the Civil War as this anti-Black group, and it died out. But in the 1920s, it came back as particularly an anti-Catholic, because America was a very WASP, very Protestant, very white country. And they saw, they thought the Pope was, infiltrating America, and prohibition, strangely enough, prohibition against alcohol, which was in place for that same period of time, was very much a way to get at these mostly Catholic immigrants, because they thought that alcohol was kind of bound up with their culture. And it was also a way to get at urban elites. Those were the groups in Middle America who felt themselves under threat. And all of that, to me, feels strangely reminiscent of recent times.
But how do you explain it's possible that in 1891, Italians in America were still considered on the same level as being black in America? They were not white, at least. And now, more than 130 years later, that's not so long. Nobody, I would say, in the US would say, as an Italian American, you're not white. So this is remarkable, I think, how fast this all develops, how fast the discrimination that was quite heavy, quite extreme, quite shocking, disappeared.
Yeah, I mean, these things happen, I think, with, as I say, the difference between my great-grandparents who emigrated, their lives and the way they were treated, and then looking at my grandfather and the discrimination he faced and what he and the people of his generation did about it, which was to first form these gangs to sell illegal alcohol. So they were living the American dream in the only way that was available to them, since they couldn't, they weren't going to be able to go to college or anything like that. And then when you move to my parents' generation, it wasn't. Both of my parents were Italian, from Italian backgrounds, in the same families. I mean, in the same town. So at that era, you still had people tending to marry other people who were like them. And then from that to my generation, when it didn't matter. I mean, no, I didn't think about, were my friends Italian or whatever they were. It didn't even matter to me. But that kind of what you're talking about, I think of when I lived in the Netherlands. People, there was at that time the really visceral debates about Islam in the Netherlands and immigrants. And I thought it was curious, the difference that people in the way people regarded Moroccans say, and Indonesians. And they would say, oh, but he's Dutch, you know? So, I mean, that's just in your mind. And you do that because of maybe the way they speak the language and, you know, certain triggers that get set off in your mind, you know? And I think that can happen, that change can happen very quickly and people can be kind of accepted.
So I mean, there's so many reasons to be pessimistic. So that might be a small reason to be optimistic, that things can get better for certain minorities within short time.
Yeah, I mean, at the same time, you know, I find it so dismaying. I was working on this book and researching the history of the mob and Italian Americans and that kind of prejudice, while this it's to someone like me, it seemed out of nowhere that there's this huge anti-immigrant wave suddenly engulfs the whole country. So it made you feel like, God, nothing has changed. The 1920s and the 2020s are, you know, we're right back there.
Nothing, just it's a different group, but that's all.
Yeah, yeah.
Before I'm going to ask you, but to read a small bit of chapter 2, but I'd like to quote one more sentence, a bit more personal, because it's not only about your grandfather, but also very much about your father, Tony. And here you write about your own childhood. Indeed, a defining feature of my childhood was my dad's anger toward his father. Even though my grandfather was never around our family, the very mention of him could set my dad off. What I also admire in your book is that you postpone judgment on the people there. So also as a reader, at least for me, I felt for all those people, even though when some of them committed crimes, there was a feeling of sympathy. But I couldn't, this anger, you try to explain it later and you come up with different explanations, but do you have the feeling that you now, after having written this book, that you understand why your father was so angry?
No, but I mean, not truly, because, you know, you write a book, it's this finite thing, and human relationships are so, and a relationship between a father and a son, between my grandfather and my father, who was his eldest son, trying to fathom those things. I mean, you can't do it justice in a book, let alone in a, you know, setting like this. So no, but at the same time, one of the reasons I decided, I was so excited about this whole notion of what is possible with doing family history, that I said, I'll put together this online course about it, is you can get some kind of answer to those questions. And if you're doing a kind of an official investigation with your relatives, with your parents or your siblings or whoever, doing it for posterity or for a book, people treat you differently. You know, you're suddenly no longer their son or brother. You're this interviewer, and so they start to open up. And then you go to the next person and ask the same questions, and you start to make these connections, and this picture becomes more complicated, and your own, you grow, so much of what you grow up with about your family are stories that were packaged for a child's understanding. And for a lot of us, that's good enough for our whole lives. But if you want to try to get beneath that, I think it's possible. And it's surprising the extent to which, when you do it in kind of an official way, as an interviewer with a recorder on or something, people begin to get that. And they begin maybe to get the sense that this is history. And if I don't get this out now, it'll be gone forever, that kind of thing. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think there's something really valuable in that.
Did it change your image of your own father?
Yeah, it made me, I think, probably in common with a lot of people, I had a hard time giving my father the benefit of the doubt. I always thought he was, I would always be dismissive of his approach to things. And the overall effect of this research that I did made me see where he was coming from and the burden he had, which had to do with his grandfather and the mob. And for people who haven't read the book, it has to do with my dad I'd grown up with this notion that that my grandfather tried to pull my father into the family business, and my father had resisted it. And what I learned from these old guys was that it was pretty much the opposite, that my dad had desperately wanted in as a teenager. And his father, in order to, I think, to protect him, would like beat the shit out of him when he saw him hanging around City Cigar. And that was his way of saying, you don't need to do that. I maybe had to do this. I had no choice, but you don't need to do this. You can have a you can fully participate in society. But because they didn't communicate verbally, and this is a classic kind of father-son dynamic, because they didn't really articulate things, it set off this mutual they misunderstood. There was a profound misunderstanding that affected their whole rest of their lives, and which was very unfortunate. So that's the dynamic that we're talking about. That's at the center of this.
Not only that your father wanted to get in, but as a teenager, he was part of a rather violent gang, the Cat Gang, no?
Yeah, and that was, I think, and that's the kind of thing I really did learn. That I had no idea of, and I had no idea my dad was part of a gang, and he did that, I think, as a reaction to his father not letting him in. He was showing him, look, I can do this too.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you to read the beginning of chapter 2, a short question, because in this chapter we will also get to know a character named Pipi better. Pipi is quite an important character in your book. It's about a murder. Why did you decide to make this murder, to put it in the center of your book? Did you want the reader to be aware that even though your descriptions of the mob are far from glamour, that there is still, even the small town mob, there's blood on the hands of the people involved?
Every one of the old guys who I sat down with when I began, they said, you know about Pipi, right? Pipi was a bookie who was murdered, and the murder was never solved. And so at first I thought, well, I'm writing about the mob. Here's a murder. I guess I'll include the murder in the story. Why not? But as I got further into it, I came to realize that it was really central to the story, having to do with the timing of it. There had not been murders in that realm in the town. It happened in 1960, just as Kennedy was coming into the White House, and he brought his brother, with a lot of controversy, brought his brother, Bobby Kennedy, in as Attorney General. And up until about that point, the federal government was trying to deny that there was such a thing as this organized Italian mafia that was all over the country. Bobby Kennedy came in with a mandate to clean up the country, to get rid of the mob, to crack down on the mob. At the same time, suddenly there's this murder of a bookie in town. And so the mayor of this little town in Pennsylvania is actually communicating with the Attorney General of the United States, because he comes in and he's active all over the country trying to crack down on this activity. So suddenly there's FBI agents in town, and that really is the beginning of the end of the operation for Russ and Little Joe. So I slowly realized that murder actually was very, very central to the story.
To the decline of your grandfather's business.
Yeah, exactly.
I would like you to read the beginning of chapter 2.
Yes, thank you. This is the beginning of chapter 2, and it's called The Victim. I'm not sure whether it's obligatory for a mob story to have a murder at its center, but I realized quite early in my research that this one has one. I became obsessed enough by it that the victim, the excellently named Pippi DeFalco, whose murder has never been solved, became a presence in our house. "What are you working on?" my wife would ask. "Pippi," I'd say, or "Pippi's autopsy," or "forensic speculation as to whether it's possible to determine for sure that it was actually an ice pick that Pippi was stabbed in the chest with, or just some generic thin pointed blade." Or "Pippi's last day," one particular moment of which hovered in my mind. It hovers still. It's February 6th, 1960, about 5 in the afternoon. Darkness is falling. The Chevy Bel Airs and Ford Thunderbirds maneuvering their wide bodies off Walnut Street onto Main are snapping on their headlights, making a sheen against the wet pavement. Saturday night is coming. Pippi DeFalco is limping across Main Street. The weather is sleety, temperature in the high 30s. Pippi's a small man wearing a big overcoat. He has an open face, puppyish eyes, shows lots of teeth when he smiles. Kind of a goofy expression, which gives an impression of innocence. But that's misleading. People say there was something else going on. "Nice guy," his one-time partner told me, but not a nice guy. Pippi was what you would call a creature of habit. He left his home in the morning. He lived with his wife and infant son in an apartment in Morelville, one of the oldest sections of town, a neighborhood of steelworkers' houses and lots of churches, and drove along the river. On his right rose a steep wooded hill, at the top of which the town's rich families had their homes. On his left, he passed one of the 4 steel mill plants that powered the town's rise in the 20th century. Today, they're as silent as Greek ruins, but in Pippi's time, they incessantly poured smoke out of their high, skinny stacks. Every day, the smoke put a fresh red-gray coat of dust on all the cars in town, which nobody minded wiping off, because if the mills were churning, so was the town. Johnstown had just peaked as a small industrial powerhouse. The population of 53,000 was already on decline, but good blue-collar jobs were still plentiful, and there were a lot of managerial and professional types as well. Today, the city is hollowed out, with neighborhoods of boarded-up houses and a population less than a third of what it was. In Pippi's time, it rocked, shift workers crowding into the mill gates, the trolley cars full, housewives browsing the downtown storefronts. He crossed the river and entered downtown. If he chose to follow Washington Street, he would have driven past the public library and the big squat rectangular box of the Penn Traffic department store, its display windows showing lady mannequins, stiff but elegant in sheath dresses. He found a place to park on Vine Street and limped down to the Acme supermarket on Market Street. He bought the same thing every day: a loaf of bread, a half-pound of sliced bologna, a small pot of mustard. Then he headed up to Main Street, turned left, came to a stop in front of the ticket booth of the Embassy Theater. Today, the marquee said Operation Petticoat. The 11:45 a.m. show flickered into the mostly empty hall. Cary Grant and Tony Curtis, bright in Eastman color, were officers on a Navy sub who had to contend with 5 nurses who just had to be squeezed in, as the trailer screamed over a sexy flash from the horn section. Sometime after the picture started, Pippi's stomach would have been rumbling. His routine was to pull out a pocket knife, use it to spread the mustard, peel off a few slices of bologna, and start eating his sandwich. He'd do the same thing later for an early dinner, watching shows in succession if it was a double bill. Pippi wasn't a movie buff, he was just killing time. Sometimes he had to leave the theater and walk around a bit to stretch his legs, but doing that meant he had to pay again to get back in, so he didn't do it often. When it came to hoarding money, Pippi had great fortitude. In his pocket, as he sat in the embassy, was a thick roll of bills. Nobody knows exactly how much he carried that day, but the man who many people think killed him later that night told me with cheerful certainty that Pippi had 2 pocketfuls of hundreds on him. Pippi was famous for his cash rolls. People say he typically toted $3,000 in cash as he made his rounds, a pretty fabulous sum in 1960. He left the theater for good around 5 p.m., ready to start his real day.
Thank you, Russell. It's a
Thank you.
beautiful point. I don't want to spoil too much, but there is in the book, as a reader, you have the idea that you as an author, as the grandson of your grandfather, at times you suspected your grandfather of being involved in the murder of Pippi. Yes, is this the right conclusion?
Well, I was trying to be a detective, and this is an unsolved murder, and I enlisted a lawyer in town who had been he was around in those days, but he was very young, and later he was a district attorney, so he kind of assisted me in trying to figure out, okay, how would I go about first of all looking in the courthouse for records and so on. And I was trying to be wide open. I didn't know who did it. And so all the people I interviewed, I asked them their thoughts. And coincidentally, a number of emails I've gotten since the book came out have brought up, potentially new leads on who did it and why. So yeah, my grandfather was in the mix too. And I had these weird feelings about, well, what if the evidence points in that direction?
Your grandfather is the main character, but also he's a very interesting character because he's so mysterious. I'd like to read two sentences, two quotes, one from the beginning and one from late in the book. First, you write about him. I began to feel that I was searching for a void. Everything people said about Russ was a negation. He was very quiet. The stories about him mostly weren't. Instead, they revolved around him, as if the events and characters were in orbit around a dark star at the center. And then later you write on page 118 something that made me smile, because your grandfather was, you write it yourself, he was a cheat in many ways. He cheated also his wife. Lots of guys back then had mistresses. I would say not only back then, but that's. But what kind of person would bring his mistress into his household, and not just that? So that's a question to the reader, but also I'd like to give the question back to you. What kind of person would bring a mistress? Because that's what your grandfather did. One of his mistresses became how would you describe the cleaning lady?
Housekeeper.
Yeah, housekeeper. So what kind of person would do that?
Well, my
self-destruction or?
Yeah, my answer is a weak person. I think he had he was very weak. Many of his traits, he had this, he was a binge drinker who would go off on these, really kind of blackout binges. He was this serial womanizer. I think, this is again, a simplistic take, but it's my reading of the evidence. He became a very powerful person in a small town and had lots and lots of money. And I think he didn't know how to handle that. He had no training for how to handle it. So, women, booze, and I think fundamentally he was quite weak. And that was, I think, other people were able to push him around, even though he made it look like he was the one in charge.
He made it look like.
Yeah.
And is it possible that this was one of the reasons your father, Tony, was so angry? Because weakness, when you detect weakness in your own father, it can be a source of anger.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so many layers, and a good interviewer pulls things out of you that you hadn't thought of before. I hadn't thought of it quite that way. I just mostly thought about it as this kind of failure to communicate. My dad didn't understand why his father, kept him out of the business, and that escalated into something else. Then once my father had a family, his father never came to visit, even though he was in the same town. But yeah, I mean, that could be it too. He wanted a strong father figure, and he knew or sensed that he didn't have it.
This, at the end of the book, also very touching scene that's basically you come closer to your own father, and maybe you can say that you forgave him all the cheesiness you despised when he before that time. But then there was one sentence that really struck me, and I found it very beautiful as well. You write, "We weren't the scarred victims of his troubled past, but rather the beneficiaries of it." So you turn it around. You turn the past into something that's not victimizing you, but it's, even though it's troubled and there are scars, you can be also it can benefit you. It's not only something dark and evil and turning one generation after one generation into victims. The opposite is possible as well. That's my interpretation. Is that correct? Is that something you can agree with?
Yeah, and again, I would go back to my kind of, after years of doing history about other people and way in the past, doing that, bringing that to bear on my own family and my own background, had something of that effect. And that's why I just have this notion that it's maybe not for everybody, but for a lot of people to really do kind of attempt a systematic investigation of what's back there can be, I mean, it sounds a little cheesy to say it, but it can be liberating.
Liberating? That's it?
No, but we have a limited amount of time.
I know, but okay, but what? Because it's quite a statement you are making here. At least that's how I felt it. I mean, it's not the troubled past. It's not so from being a victim into like. So what? Could you be a bit more specific what it did to you after unraveling all? Because basically you were unraveling, you were destroying also the myth that your own father said no to the mob. Yeah. It all turned out to be different. So
yeah, what it did for me, and what I think it can do in general, and what I've learned from students who I've worked with is it helps you to grow up. Again, you have these childish images of what happened and why and all that. And you come to see your family members, your forebears, as just, imperfect and struggling. And you see the forces that are they're struggling against. And it helps you to give them a break, and I think it's even with my grandfather, who I grew up, feeling all of these, there was this darkness around him, not so much, strangely, because he was this mob guy, as because of what he did to other people in the family with this, he had children with other women, and then he would decide, okay, I'm going to take that baby and give it to this couple who can't have a child. And these people are still around, So, but even him, I looking at what we were started with, all this, what he faced and what millions of people like him faced and face every day. What other, it's not that he had no choice, but his choices were very limited. So it helps you to be a little bit sympathetic.
Before I go to the audience, there's one, because I think we should also touch, even once briefly, on food. And in this scene I already described, you say to your father, "Thank you for making us eat pasta sauce with snails." I'm a big lover of pasta, but I never heard of pasta sauce with snails. Where does it come from? Is it like a certain part of Italy, or is it an invention in your family tradition?
I guess it's a Southern Italian thing. And my father was always on the lookout, and food wasn't as, exotic food wasn't as available in the 60s and 70s as now. And, my dad would get a line on some, so he knew some guy who was bringing snails into town. And so he would get these jars of snails, and, my mother would cook spaghetti sauce with snails in it. We'd go, ooh, but then we learned to like it.
Do you still sometimes cook spaghetti sauce with snails?
No, because I never see snails. I think I'm back in that kind of town where you don't get that. But I cook the things that, there's a cauliflower and anchovy sauce that I refer to in the book, and I make that, and I make my grandmother's spaghetti and meatballs. So those are the ways we're Italian.
I see a few questions. Jos Arts, let's start there. He asks, was the mob structure also a structure to protect the Italians against other groups, especially the Protestant ruling class, the WASPs?
Yeah, I think that's what I was talking about. That's what it was, a way to, and not, I guess there was that protectiveness, particularly against the Italian community. But, you have to remember too, that in that early era, Sicilians were not Italians. They didn't think of themselves that way, and other Italians didn't. So you had those different divides within that community. But I think the immigrant groups in the street where they lived in Johnstown when they first moved there, my great-grandparents and what my grandfather grew up with, there were a lot of Hungarians and Poles and Irish. And so, those people kind of clustered together. So that again gets at the point that I think it was this kind of ethnic groups who had the lower level jobs and who were discriminated against. They kind of collectively felt that these guys were on their side.
Yeah. Then there's a question. I see Kelly van Driessen. So mafia funded the education of their children, and education broke the vicious circle. Is this correct, Russell?
Maybe she's referring to, I talked about how some people told me that my grandfather would, or his partner would just pay for someone's kid to go to college. And it was apparently kind of loose, whether it was a loan or a gift. So again, I guess there's something to that, what they're saying, that irony. I just think of it in terms of these guys kind of didn't know, maybe they didn't know, they just wanted to look like they were big and magnanimous, and that's how they did it. It's, curiously enough, in both cases, with Russ and Little Joe, they left very little behind in terms of money. It all went right out.
It all went because they, if I can add this question, they lost it basically.
Well, they did things like this. They gave it away. They also, as I describe in the book, there was the very strict rule: you didn't look showy in town. They both had nice houses in middle class neighborhoods and nice cars, but they no Cadillacs, no bespoke suits. But when you left town, they would go to Florida, they would go to Atlantic City, and then you would splurge. They would rent out the top floor of the swankiest hotel, and it was room service and all that kind of stuff.
But also, if you can, at the end of the book, you describe this beautiful scene, this delicious scene about this big hoax with the box, and that's some of the, I think it's Mike, if I'm not, he made so much money that he really didn't know what to do with it. And basically, you're right, literally, it was not about the money for him. It was more about the kick of taking, of swindling these people. Yeah.
There's those different kind of, this isn't just that, kind of social scientific overlay of, what did this ethnic group do in this situation? You just had different personalities. And Mike is somebody who I really loved getting to know, who was my grandfather's protege. And he went on to run his own cons and was very eloquent with me. And as you said at the beginning, you could learn to, I want to be a con man. This is, and then you start to feel like, hey, well, I think we're all kind of con men in one way or another. Mike could have written a book on that. And he told me this story of one of his his last con, which I detailed in the book because he gave it to me as a way of saying this was his homage to Russ.
A question from Bart. Bart says, Russell said the dynamics of the prohibition reminds him of recent events in the US. Does he think is history repeating itself in the US, mistrust of foreigners, or is the USA becoming more European? And he means European in a negative way.
I don't know if history is repeating itself. I fear that history never went away, that this has, been the case for the longest time. And I think that Americans like me fooled themselves into thinking the country was becoming more accepting and progressive. And And then here, you know, all they needed was as an excuse to show their true colors, and millions of people come flooding through with this, you know, racist, xenophobic. But, you know, then let me just take the other side of that and say that in towns like Johnstown was a huge Trump town and still is probably. Those towns, one thing I've a kind of undercurrent to my research was really focusing on small town America and how completely left out it is in, you know, in all the good things that have happened in recent decades. They've lost the steel mills and the factories, but and then nothing replaces it except, you know, like opioid addiction and that kind of thing. So that kind of frustration is very understandable. And
is the cure? Is the solution?
I just wrote a book, Arnon. I don't know. I'm not a prophet.
I know. This is a too big question. Okay, the last question, and then I think we. This is Fabian Kuiper. Russell, while doing research for this book, did you experience any form of hostility or resistance from people you were interviewing?
Well, if I was interviewing them, then they were willing to be interviewed. And I think for the most part, people were open to it. And as I said before, they realized, you know, this is history. This stuff is gone, and they have a piece of it. So why not try to get it out there in some way, you know? And a number of people who've written to me since the book came out, who are from the town, have said something to the effect of, you know, I always had one window onto what was going on, but this was always hush hush. So you've kind of put it together into one picture. So now I have a better sense of, you know, of what the town was like and what life was like then. So
I see maybe we have time for really one last question. Jan Willem Reitsma, as you described very eloquently, the making of this book changed your relation with your father. Would you say that it's also changed you, and if so, in which way? And this is your Dutch translator.
I was just going to take the time not to answer that question because it's too hard to answer, but instead to thank Jan Willem Reitsma for doing such an elegant and eloquent translation of the book. He had one great question for me about like the meaning of something. It was something Mike said about this guy he thought he could fake it with dice, that he could cheat with dice, but he couldn't make a 7 with a pencil. That was Mike's phrase. And Jan Willem was like, how shall I say this in Dutch? Anyway, thank you, Jan Willem. And let me just also say before we close, I just quickly scanned through, and there's so many friends on this call. I see Patricia, I see Lawrence Ubink, my publisher at Ambulantos, Martin van Essen, Julie Phillips, so many people. So I miss you all. And thanks for being here.
Thank you, Russell, for being here, and so many more things we could have talked about. Also, you mentioned already how to cheat with dice and how to be good at it. And the remark, the question, how you translate this particular remark. There's so many details that are worth talking about longer. I'd like to urge the audience, people who are listening to this conversation, to go to the link and to buy the book. You might have understood. I think you understand now that it's really worth reading, and you can support ABC, and I think that's also a good thing to do, especially now. So thank you again, Russell. I hope we'll meet again in New York for a cup of coffee or a glass of wine, and we don't have to Zoom. So next time, not in Jerusalem, but in New York.
Right.
And thank you all. Have a good evening and be safe.
Thank you, Arnon. And Lynn from ABC, thank you as well for hosting this.
Yeah.
Bye all.
Bye.